Today, we're going to look at 1 Timothy chapter 5. The Bible starts out by saying, don't rebuke an older man. Now, why would Paul say it to Timothy? Paul knew that Timothy was a younger man, and every once in a while, a younger guy can sort of get this big head like he's a big shot. And he says, be careful. Older people deserve respect. And so treat him like you would a father. Even if you have to admonish him and kind of tell him, look, you're going in the wrong direction. And Timothy, you might know that because you know the word. But do it gently and with a spirit of humility. He says the same thing in Galatians chapter 6. He says, if you're going to restore someone, do it with the spirit of humility so you don't fall into sin. He says older women, treat them as mothers. Younger men as brothers, and younger women as sisters. Now that's a big one. How do you look at younger women? And, women who might even be your own age. How do you look at them with purity? Imagine that they're your sister, because they are. They are your sister in Christ. And so now he goes on and he starts to talk about widows. Now, widows in this day were a whole different sect of the population in that they were in big trouble financially. And their livelihood was in trouble. They didn't have a man to provide for them. And it wasn't like they could go out and get the same kind of jobs that men could get or do the same physical kind of work that men could do. And they were in jeopardy of starvation. And so when they were part of the church says, well, we can't allow that to happen. They're part of us. Well, in the same way we do today, we help people who come in, off the street or from our church. Well, Paul gives a huge set of qualifications of people who should be eligible for that money. Now, keep in mind, yesterday we learned that Jesus didn't come into this world to cure poverty, to cure AIDS. He's concerned about those things, but his main purpose was to seek and to save that which was lost, to give us life more abundantly. And, that's the purpose of the church, too. And so if you just start to empty the offering plate into the pockets of everyone who comes in off of the street saying, look, I need my bills paid, then you're not going to have church and you're not going to fulfill the mission that God gave to us. And so Paul takes this seriously and gives a set of qualifications that need to be met for this to be on this list of widows to be helped. He says in verse 3, give proper recognitions to widows who are really in need. He goes on to say the ones that are in need. Verse 4, they don't have any children or grandchildren at all. If they have children or grandchildren that are believing, then they need to take care of their mom, their grandma. That is their responsibility. In fact, he goes on to say, look, if you don't, you're worse than an infidel. You're worse than an unbeliever if you don't take care of your believing relatives or even unbelieving relatives. You need to do that. That's you're paying them back, he says in this passage. It's what you owe them. And so don't think that just because you're out of the house doesn't mean you don't have responsibilities. You do. He says also they need to be over 60 years old. Why? Well, because he says if they're under 60, a few things could happen. In verse 11, he says that he deals with younger widows and says, look, they have this pledge that they need to make. If they're going to go on this widow's list, then they need to be a widow and not someone who's just going to go off and marry somebody and maybe even an unbeliever. He says also younger widows, in verse 13, have the propensity to be idle and gossips, busybodies. Now, before you get too hard on Paul's just saying in general, men are more prone toward lust. Women are more prone toward gossip. Can men gossip? Absolutely. But men are less likely to be tearing up the phone lines than women. That's just what he's saying here. Argue with the Apostle Paul. But he says, look, if we provide financial income for these widows so they don't have to do work or don't develop any other relationships, and they're going to be busybodies. And so he just basically is saying, look, be careful of this. In verse 10, he says, make sure that this woman who's over 16 has no grandchildren or children is a person of good deeds. In verse 9, he says, make sure she's been faithful to her husband. I mean, he makes the qualifications really stiff. And as a church, I don't know that we hold to these exact things, but what I can tell you is it's important to make sure that where the money goes, the benevolence kind of money in the church, that it's well spent. And it's not just being used by panhandlers who come in off the street who just don't want to work and go from church to church. And so that's, I think, his point here. Well, in the last part of this chapter, in verse 17, he says, elders who direct the affairs of the church are worthy of double honor, especially those whose work is preaching and teaching. What he says is there's two kinds of elders. There's ruling elders, and there's teaching elders. And they're worthy of double honor. The word honor comes from the word honorarium, or it's where we get our word, honorarium. They're worthy of double pay, basically. They're worthy of being paid generously. Now, what he's saying is, in the early church, these weren't little churches that, would meet in, the small living room of some, buddy. These were actually got to be pretty good size, to where they had a good staff of ruling elders and teaching elders, in other words, pastors. Several teaching pastors and several ones that would direct the affairs. In other words, like an executive pastor. We're talking like pretty good-sized churches. He says both are important, and the ones that teach are even more important, in other words, because you can't rule a bunch of babies, okay? You rule over people who are growing up and maturing in their faith. And so he says that these people are worthy of being paid, and that's his point there. In verse 22, he says, don't be hasty in laying on hands and share the sins of others. Now, when he says that, he's talking about the same topic here. Don't make somebody an elder before you know him. Don't make him a pastor before you know him. Make sure that they're not going to go out and do something stupid. And you're going to take part in their sin because they did something stupid. Make sure they're not too young. Make sure they understand the word. Make sure that they're going to make good decisions. That's why he says laying on of hands, because that's how they would confirm them as a pastor in their church. And then last, in verse 23, he says, stop drinking only water. What was going on was Timothy had made a vow he wasn't going to drink alcohol. Now you say, why? Well, probably for the same reason I have. I look around, and my staff looks around, and our elders, we've all made that same commitment. Why? Well, because we look around and we see the problems that it's causing. I mean, more than half of the issues we deal with in counseling, way more than half, are attributed to alcohol. And it's oftentimes just begins with this social drinking kind of a thing. The Bible never forbids taking a social drink. Never. And so I don't forbid that in my teaching and never would. But as far as wisdom is concerned, I don't think it's wise for me to drink, and so I don't. Well, Timothy had that same belief, but there was a problem. The water wasn't any good, and he needed medicine. And so Paul says, look, I understand the social drinking thing. That's smart. That's good. But you need medicine. If you need alcohol for the medicine, then fine. Or to keep yourself from drinking water that's going to kill you, then do it. And so they were living in a little bit of a different day. And also, it's a good admonition to say, look, if you need medicine, take it. Medicine of any kind. There are all kinds of medicine that people take. And some people in the church, they say, oh, well, if you take that kind of medicine, that's not good. Baloney. If it's prescribed, I believe you ought to take it. Well, anyway, I hope you read this chapter. Have a great day, and we'll see you tomorrow. God bless you.